We've been speaking with some residents of Monrovia off and on for the past couple of weeks, and we thought that it was important that we address the whole community in regards to living with bears in Southern California. So why don't we go ahead and get started here. We have one species of bear in California, and that's the American black bear. Traditionally, they were inhabited mostly Northern California, but they currently inhabit all of the mountainous areas of the state. Prior to the 1920s, the California grizzly inhabited much of the state, and they were extirpated in the 1920s. And since that time, the black bear has made a gradual expansion southward. The more recent expansions you see here in the darker red color, recent meaning the last 30 to 40 years. Bears stand about 5 to 6 feet tall. They can weigh up to 600 pounds, but that's a maximum. The average is 150 to 300 pounds. And they can live 25 to 30 years in the wild, which is pretty extraordinary for a wild animal to live that long of a life in the wild. There is oftentimes some confusion about bears in California because they have different coat colors. We see the black coat color primarily in Northern California. In Southern California, we see a reddish cinnamon brown color coat. And there's also a blonde phase, which is found in areas where they have extensive snows in the wintertime. It's pretty rare to see those, but it's still, they're still all black bears. Black bears begin breeding early in June, and they have an adaptation called delayed implantation. And what this is the fertilized eggs don't immediately implant into the womb. They carry them around inside the womb, but not implanted. And this allows the animal to both breed and give birth in optimal periods of time. And it's a physiological adaptation to body condition, so that if there's insufficient fat reserves, the sow or the female bear will spontaneously abort one or more of the fertilized eggs. If there are sufficient fat reserves, the sow can have up to 5 cubs. And it's important to note that human food sources can facilitate local population increases. In the wild, the bears may give birth to 1 or 2 cubs. Those cubs may survive to adulthood. And in the urban environment where we have 24/7 access to food, water, and shelter, those fat reserves more often than not are sufficient enough for multiple births. And so we see this concentration of an expanding population within the urban interface. And that's another reason why we see more and more bears in our urban areas. The bear will give birth to an underdeveloped fetus in midwinter. The cub will continue to mature in the den. The cubs will emerge with the sow in the spring. They're weaned by midsummer, and the cubs stay with the sow until they're 18 to 20 months old. And during this time, she's teaching them social and foraging behavior, but they can be independent as early as 6 months of age. A baby bear weighs less than a pound, and they're fully grown within 5 years. So if you think about that, from less than a pound to 150 to 300 pounds within 5 years, that's a tremendous amount of growth. And that takes a tremendous amount of food to build that body condition and maintain that body condition. And that's another thing that the urban environment is providing for these animals, is sufficient food resources. Black bears are omnivores, meaning that they eat everything. They have a generally vegetarian diet, but they will commonly consume animal protein. Their diet varies seasonally and with availability, and most of their reliance on human food is in late summer and fall. Now, I do need to make a distinction between, you'll hear me mention wild bears and urban bears. Of course, they're all wild animals. But when I'm speaking about wild bears, I'm mainly talking about their foraging habits versus the urban bear, which is a food conditioned bear. So this scenario where it varies seasonally and most of the reliance is in the summer and the fall, we're talking about the wild feeding bears. Our food conditioned bears rely on us all times of the year, and their diet really doesn't vary too much from the human food sources. Adults, bears are generally solitary, and their home range size varies depending on sex, age, population density, and food availability. We believe that in the San Gabriel Mountains, bears have a home range size of about 3 to 11 square miles, and they have smaller home ranges in the urban interface. Again, they have a dense population, they have plenty of food available, so they don't have to travel very far for their food sources. So maybe 1 to 3 square miles at most. And they have been known to move 100 or more miles, particularly when they're relocated. Here's a graphical depiction of the home range. We've got a male bear with a large home range, and then we've got a couple of female bears, and their home ranges are smaller within the males. They've had cubs. The female cubs will stay within the natal range, and then we have the juvenile males that will disperse outside of the natal range. And a lot of times it's these juvenile males that we see causing problems in the urban areas. Black bears use a variety of different vegetation types, from conifers and hardwoods to brush and meadows. There's a picture of a canyon that's in the Angeles National Forest, very typical of the habitat that bears reside in. And this is actually kind of unusual for a black bear because they're arboreal, they live in trees. So they have really adapted to our scrub habitat down here in Southern California. And of course, they've become experts at adapting to the urban interface. Bears begin a period of fattening in the fall, which means they're eating even more. They generally den in December. And in Southern California, we have a unique situation. We have mild winters and abundant food sources. And hibernation is a way that is a modification that allows them to deal with harsh winters. So we don't have those harsh winters. Our bears go through what's called a seasonal torpor. It's not a true hibernation. Most of the bears will retreat back into the forest. They will reduce their activity, but they'll still be somewhat active. They'll den late in the season or perhaps not at all. As a matter of fact, primarily the sows that will be giving birth will generally den up for the winter, and the others will remain active. We've seen a steady increase in the bear population statewide over the past 30 to 35 years. And these are conservative estimates because they're based on our hunter harvest, and not all areas of the state that have bears are hunted. In the 1990s, there were some estimates. There were about 400 to 500 adult bears in the Angeles National Forest. And it was predicted that there was a 5% rate of increase since the 1970s. Well, I don't have that original data, so I had to kind of extrapolate out to present day. And this is not statistically sound, but that we have approximately 1,400 bears in the Angeles National Forest. And the Angeles is about 1,000 square miles. So as you can see, there's more bears than there is available habitat in the National Forest. So that's another reason why we're seeing more and more bears in the urban interface, again, because that population is growing, expanding, and they're not retreating back into the forest because they are accustomed to our human food sources. So when does the Department of Fish and Wildlife become involved in bear incidents? The Department of Fish and Wildlife is the steward agency for wildlife in California. We take reports for sightings, property damage, and other incidents, either remotely by phone or by email, or on scene whenever possible. We're the lead agency for public safety incidents. We're mandated to maintain healthy bear populations. And the goal of our statewide bear policy is to provide the public tools to minimize conflicts and at the same time avoid negative impact to the population, to the bear population. So I'll spend a few minutes on our depredation policy. And depredation is a word that we use when a wild animal has damaged personal property. The first category we have here is a no harm, no foul bear. This is a bear that's wandered in fresh from the forest. It's naive to humans. It's there for food and not for confrontation. And that's typically those juvenile males that are expanding out of their natal range. They're simply at the wrong place at the wrong time. And generally, if we give it space and enough time, it will find its own corridor back up to open habitat or we can haze or move it to the nearest habitat. Category 2 is a habituated or nuisance bear. There's been no property damage, but the bear's tipping over garbage cans, maybe peeking into windows, getting into, bird feeders, or just kind of napping on lawns, or just being a general nuisance. We generally recommend corrective measures such as obtaining bear-resistant garbage cans, removing attractants such as pet foods, keeping the barbecue grill clean, managing koi ponds, because a lot of times that can be a very big attractant for bears. Sometimes we recommend fencing or electrical fencing around sensitive structures, hazing, which is scaring the animal away. And because we've had generations now of bears that have grown up in the urban area, these bears are pretty much born as a category 2 habituated nuisance bear. The sows have taught the cubs how to live off of human food sources. And if we were to move it back into the forest, they probably wouldn't even know how to forage on natural foods, or they would make their way to the nearest campground or cabin. So like I say, our urban bears are primarily category 2 bears at this point. Category 3 is where property damage occurs. Hazing is no longer effective. These animals are so spoiled and habituated that they no longer can be hazed. Again, we do require corrective measures. And if the homeowner has implemented all of the measures that we've requested, and the damage still continues, they can request a depredation permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that's a permit that allows the landowner to kill a bear. Something to remember about our foothill cities, though, is that most of them have very strict firearms ordinances. So there's really not an easy way to kill that bear. And we basically want to avoid that at all costs anyways. And that's our goal. We don't want to wait until it gets to a situation where property damage occurs. And we want to target those category 1 and category 2 bears, and removing all of our attractants to prevent property damage. In LA County, between 2006 and 2018, 11 depredation permits were issued and 7 bears were taken. You contrast that with Northern California, El Dorado County, for example, the same time period, almost 400 permits were issued and 105 bears were taken. So Northern California is still our area of our densest bear population. They have a lot more incidents than we do down in Southern California. Bear-resistant garbage cans are one of our recommended measures that we require or request landowners to get. And this garbage can here, you can't really see the can. It just looks like a traditional residential garbage can. This was tested on a grizzly bear, and the grizzly couldn't get inside. And garbage can manufacturers are making improvements all the time. This particular can is fully automated so that when the apparatus comes and picks it up, the locking mechanism is on the sides, and the bear can't open up the garbage can from the sides. When the can is emptied and it's dumped back down onto the street, it relocks. And so this, a lot of the garbage companies will have objections to bear-resistant canisters because they're not completely automated. And this one is a spectacular product. If people don't have access to bear-resistant garbage cans, we always recommend some sort of shed or keeping them in a garbage can. And if you do that, you need to disinfect the cans every week with either bleach or ammonia to keep the scents down. And if all else fails, get creative. This was at a Boy Scout camp up in the hills, and they have a very strict garbage policy, but they didn't have access to a bear resistance dumpster, so they came up with their own solution. And the point here is that sometimes we just have to think out of the box and to outsmart the bears. So a common question that we get is, why don't you just tranquilize the bear and move it away? One of the things that we have to consider is chemical immobilization during hunting season. The drugs that we use to immobilize wildlife are administered under our veterinarian's license. There's a federal regulation that requires that no controlled substances are to enter the food chain. Certain drugs that we use remain in the system for up to 14 days. So if we were to chemically immobilize a bear during hunting season and set it back into the forest, there's a small chance that a hunter could take the bear, consume the meat, and get sick. And if that were to happen, our veterinarian would lose their license, and all of our state employees would lose, risking chemical immobilization as a very valuable tool for managing wildlife. So because of that, we do not chemically immobilize wildlife 14 days prior to, during, and 14 days after hunting season. Now, this is the most active period for bears. Our hunting season is the second weekend in October through December. So this is the most active period for bears. And this doesn't apply to public safety incidents or bears that are injured or sick because they're not placed back into the food chain. We also have inherent limitations of our equipment. Our dart guns are sophisticated pieces of equipment, and they look like rifles, but they don't shoot like rifles. For one thing, the charges that we use are the same charges that you use for your staple guns that you get in Home Depot. And those charges are notorious for being very inconsistent. The darts are just metal hollow tubes that are filled with liquids. So sometimes if you shoot that out of the dart gun, it'll go spiraling off into the distance and not make its mark. So we always have a spare dart drawn up just in case that happens. But more often than not, a missed target is a missed opportunity because the bear will run away. We also have a very large animal, but we have a very small target. That's our target, the shoulder area. Now, you might think that the rear end is a likely target, and it's usually what's presented to us in the field, but there's a lot of fat deposits on the rear end. And if we were to shoot the dart into the rear end, those fat deposits would just absorb the chemical, and it would prevent the chemical from getting into the bloodstream. So we may have an animal that doesn't go down at all in that case. Another common misconception is that as soon as that dart enters into the skin, that animal is down. And that's completely incorrect. It takes anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes under perfect conditions for that drug to even begin to take effect. And again, those large fat deposits will increase the induction time. Stress chemicals also will increase the induction time. The adrenaline will metabolize the drug. So sometimes it will be waiting for 15, 20 minutes before we even see any type of reaction. And bears will run after they're darted. They can run up to 25 miles per hour, which means they can travel 1 to 2 miles before the drug starts taking effect. So we have to consider that. Here's a map of Monrovia. Norumbega is a hot spot for bears in the city. And all of these points here are things like, well, pre-COVID, elementary schools, we've got retirement centers, not to mention all of the subdivisions that we have to keep in mind. And we really have to take that into consideration when we're about to chemically immobilize a bear. Treed bears are another challenge. There's no escape route. So if we're darting from below, that animal is just going to run farther up the tree, and that's going to affect our ability to remove it. Their chest can become wedged in the branches, and as they lose consciousness, they can suffocate. They can fall from the trees, and we've had bears die from this. So sow and cubs is another challenge in capturing the entire family. In a trap situation, usually the adult will be the only one that will go in, and the trap door closes, and the cubs will scatter. And usually we're not there to see that happen, so we're not even aware of how many cubs that sow might have. Chemical immobilization, the same thing. We can only tranquilize one animal at a time, and we try not to tranquilize cubs whenever possible. So there's that situation where the sow will take off and the cubs will scatter. There's also increased danger for the field personnel on the ground because we're trying to get close enough to that bear to dart it, and she's protective of her cubs. So we don't want to increase that danger to our personnel. And finally, we don't want to introduce drugs into a nursing bear system. So I wanted to spend a little time on our policy to relocate wildlife. To move or to relocate, what's the difference? Well, when you see us on the news in hand with a bear, more often than not, that bear has gotten itself into a situation that it can't get out of on its own. So it needs our assistance to get it out of that situation. So we will move that animal to the nearest available habitat, which is generally less than a mile. We don't relocate, which is more than 25 miles. We don't relocate an animal to prevent human-wildlife conflict. There are many reasons for that, but primarily because they can travel extraordinary distances to get back to their home range. We take it out of their home range, suddenly it doesn't know where its resources are, and it's going to come right back to what it knows. So again, our policy is to move it to the nearest available habitat. Under extraordinary circumstances, we can get permission to move it over 25 miles. And that is not a decision that's made on the ground, that's made up in Sacramento. And it doesn't fix the heart of the problem, which is the food and the attractants, which brought the animals into the neighborhoods to begin with and is keeping them there. Bear number 210 is an example of an extraordinary circumstance. Several years ago, there was a bear that traveled south of the 210, and this was not in Monrovia, this was another city, but it traveled south of the 210, and we were concerned that it would get hit by a car, either on the busy streets south of the 210 or on the freeway itself. So we originally moved that bear up into the nearest available habitat, and within a week, it was back below the 210 freeway, getting into garbage cans and getting into refrigerators and so forth. So we moved it again, and in the meantime, a juvenile bear had come into that same neighborhood. That juvenile bear actually got hit by a car, which was what we were trying to avoid to begin with. And in the meantime, 210 had came back into below the 210 freeway. So long story short, we got approval to move it, to relocate it over 25 miles, and guess what? It came back. So after a while, we only had two choices. One was to euthanize it, which we didn't want to do, and the other was to place it in captivity. So we found a captive facility that has that bear to this day, and it's not really a happy ending because, you know, this is a free-ranging wild bear that's now in a cage for the rest of its life. But that is an example of an extraordinary circumstance and the reason why we don't relocate wildlife to try and resolve human-wildlife conflicts, because they always come back into the neighborhood or they find another similar neighborhood to cause problems in. So I want to spend the next few slides on talking about public safety incidents and some of the animal behaviors that we look at to guide our decisions. Some of the pictures you'll see mountain lions. The point that I'm making is still the same with bears and mountain lions. So an imminent threat means that there's a likelihood of human injury based on the totality of the circumstances. So if we have a call of, you know, a bear attacking a human, we go on scene, we see this, the first reaction is that, oh my God, this guy's being attacked. We need to do something and kill this animal so it doesn't kill the guy. If we look at the whole picture though, you find out that this is a zoo situation. This was a captive bred and born bear that's messing around with its trainer, and it's not really attacking this guy at all. So that's kind of my lame attempt at trying to visualize the fact that we don't make a move unless, we don't make a decision unless we look at the totality of the circumstances for a given incident. Law enforcement determines public safety incidents. So our wildlife officers, the police department, a park ranger, Forest Service enforcement, or any other law enforcement agency can make that determination. Many animals communicate agitation in a stereotypic way, particularly this one here. You see the ears are flattened to the side of the head. It's showing its teeth. It's probably vocalizing. I mean, look at those whiskers splayed out. And you can't really see it, but the hair is standing up on end. I mean, this is an agitated animal. So if we get a call that there's a mountain lion acting aggressively and we arrive on scene and this is what we see and this animal is behaving in this way, that's one factor that we look at to determine whether or not that's truly aggressive behavior and whether or not we need to take action. So these animals are completely different. This is a relaxed face. Even though the whisker's out, the hair isn't standing on end. It's not vocalizing. It's obviously just yawning. Same with the bear. This animal, you might think, okay, well, it's stalking something and it's a danger, but what it's actually trying to do, if you look at the whole situation, is it's just trying to hide in the brush and not be noticed. Another common misconception is that when bears stand up on their hind legs, they're about to charge and it's all over, you're going to get hurt. But that's completely untrue. Bears stand up on their hind legs to get a better view of something in the distance. You know, their ears are pointed forward. They're probably looking at the photographer and trying to determine whether or not they should continue forward or if they should escape another route. So the take-home message is that the mere presence of wildlife in your neighborhood does not necessarily pose an imminent threat to public safety. Remember, imminent threat means that this animal is so aggressive that someone will be injured if something isn't done, and usually immediate euthanasia is required. Generally, most animals with space and time, they will leave the area and they can be hazed without a mass response from an agency. And we're really fortunate in Southern California because the predatory animals that we have are not inherently aggressive towards humans. If you think of African lion, polar bear, these types of animals are inherently aggressive towards humans, and their mere presence is an imminent threat to public safety. Black bears are not inherently aggressive towards humans. Mountain lions are not inherently aggressive towards humans. So if they were, we would have completely different policies. An informed public is the most effective solution to most problems related to bears. Number one recommendation, never ever feed bears intentionally or unintentionally through your garbage, through your fruit trees, your bird feeders. Anything that has a scent or is edible is food for a bear. And there are consequences of feeding wildlife that you can't even imagine. It's kind of hard to see this picture, but this is a deer here, and this is a bear. And in this particular neighborhood, the wildlife were being fed by residents, and the deer were being fed, and they were no longer wary of the humans or their predators. A deer came into this backyard at the same time a bear was in there, and the bear took advantage of that and attacked the deer and killed the deer. That's not something that we expect to see in someone's backyard. And the whole situation could have been avoided if people just would not feed the wildlife. The deer would have been wary of the predator and it would have made its way out of the yard safely. Food conditioned bears that have caused property damage and or killed pets or livestock may be killed under the state's depredation policy and state laws. We don't want to have to issue a depredation permit for someone to kill a bear. That's the last ditch effort after everything has been tried. We don't want to have to kill an aggressive bear. And like I said before, these instances are avoidable. Feeding of wildlife is prohibited by state law and by local municipal code. And just a few more bear-human conflict prevention tips. Install or request bear-resistant garbage cans. Freeze wet garbage like meat or bones until garbage pickup day. Keep garbage inside a garage or secure building until pickup. Disinfect those containers weekly with bleach or ammonia. Clean your barbecue grills regularly. Keep pet food and water indoors. Harvest your tree fruits, especially avocados, regularly and pick up fallen fruits. And remember that bears and other wild animals are attracted to anything edible and smelly. It's against the law to feed bears. And finally, I wanted to touch a little bit on our Wildlife Watch program. The department developed Wildlife Watch, which is very similar to Neighborhood Watch that communities use to fight crime. Wildlife Watch encourages cities and other agencies to prepare comprehensive wildlife management plans, which include public education efforts that will change human behavior. Wildlife Watch establishes a comprehensive integrated management strategy that will minimize human-wildlife conflicts and improve the quality of life in urban settings. Wildlife Watch is based on conservation and ecological principles, on agency and community leadership coaching, and it teaches respect for wildlife and for one another. And the department would like to begin a Wildlife Watch program in the foothill communities. We've done it for coyotes and it's worked, and we'd like to do it again for bears. And we're hoping that Monrovia or one of the foothill communities will start to work with us on a Wildlife Watch program. If you wanted more information on Wildlife Watch, you can go to our webpage, which is www.wildlife.ca.gov. And in the search bar, just type in Wildlife Watch and you'll get a link to our Wildlife Watch page. And with that, we can start to take any questions that people might have.
Maybe I'll start off with the first question, Rebecca, if you can. Thanks so much for sharing.
Sure.
One of the things that was interesting to me was when you talked about having more bears than habitat here in Angeles National Forest. Is there any, I'll call it a reduction strategy or any push? One of the things Fish and Wildlife does is it manages the bear population. Are there any efforts underway within Angeles National Forest to manage the population downward?
At this point, no. Our bears are managed through annual hunting. We have begun a bear population study in the Angeles National Forest, where we are gathering hair samples and sending to the lab to look at the DNA. And long story short, we can tell a lot, including the number of bears that are in the Angeles. So once we get a better idea of exactly what our population is and what it's doing, then we can work on a local management plan to see what our options are.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me, Rebecca?
Yes, I can.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. So,
oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Recently just purchased a home up just past Monrovia Canyon in Monrovia. So we're now having our first encounters with bears, including the first one in our backyard. All the tips that you gave for prevention are great ones and ones that we're striving to do our best on. Although I know we can't be perfect, and we do generate trash as humans, so we're doing the best we can. When we encounter a bear, like in our backyard, so we had the situation where the bear was in our backyard with, one major driveway out, and so we kind of found ourselves in a bit of a confined situation. What are the tips for being able to get the bear to leave or otherwise move so that we can get ourselves into a safe situation, like back to the house?
Okay. Well, you basically want to back off slowly. You can look at the bear. A lot of people say don't make eye contact, but you can look at the bear, back off slowly, maybe speaking in a soft voice, just back off until you get a few feet away, and then you can get back into the home.
In this particular situation, we were in the garage, and so the bear found the one moving box we had forgotten about, some old treats that we had left in there, and so he was actually sort of how should I put it, confining us to the garage, right? So we weren't able to escape that situation and get safely back to the house. In such a situation, would you recommend things like I've read online about like air horns or clapping pots and pans together to make loud noises? What kind of things, again, might one be able to do to try to be able to make the bear want to leave or back off a bit?
Right. Well, you don't want to do that in a confined space.
Got it.
Because that's just going to agitate the animal. You can make those loud noises once it gets out into open space and it has access to a corridor away from your home. But in that situation where you're both in a confined area, more than likely it's more interested in that food than it ever is in you. So you can take that opportunity to leave the area. And I wouldn't try and make noises. I would just let it finish whatever it's doing and leave on its own.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay,
And
you're welcome.
my last question was about deterrence with a gate. Do you recommend gates as a effective deterrent for them entering the property, or just bear's going to go wherever the bear wants to go?
Yes, people don't really have too much success with gates. They are, they're traditionally, they're an arboreal animal. They climb trees. So yeah, they can pretty much climb wherever they need to go.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Next question comes from Brenda Trainer, asking what's involved in starting a wildlife watch program?
Well, we start with the city, and we have meetings with the city to discuss how they want to manage the program. I mean, we have a basic template. Different cities have different requirements. We would have, because our program is set up right now for coyotes, we would have to switch it around for bears. So we would have meetings with the city, and we would discuss the implementation of a bear management plan. Then once we got going on that, we would have town hall meetings with the residents. We would introduce the program, and we would take volunteers and city volunteers, and we train them how to do backyard audits, which are, going neighbor to neighbor, looking in the front and backyards and making sure that we have, from a checklist, making sure that the barbecue grill is clean, that there's no bird feeders, that all of the attractants are minimized. And we train them how to educate the residents on not feeding the wildlife, et cetera. And so we go around the first couple of weeks door to door with the city volunteers. And then once we get a pattern and train them, then the city takes off with the implementation of the program on their own with assistance from us. So what it really is it's teaching the community how to educate itself and to manage human wildlife conflict. Now, because we're talking about bears and not coyotes, the department would be more involved in the management aspect. But that's kind of basically how a wildlife watch program is developed.
Hey everyone, this is Amelia Vera from CDFW. I work with Rebecca as well, and I just wanted to elaborate on that. With the management plan, at least what we've done with the coyote management plans is it will also include the different types of incidents, so like a category 1, category 2, category 3, depending on how the bear is acting. And within that management plan, it will include who is going to respond, what to do, the following steps that need to be taken by the city, by the citizens, or by us, or by law enforcement as well, depending on what type of incident it is. So it just outlines everything really nicely so everybody within the city knows what's to do.
Thank you. The next question I have is from Bill. Can you elaborate on how to deal with fruit trees? We love our fruit, but can't stop the bears or the deer, raccoons, or possums. But could you elaborate on fruit trees?
Well, there's really only one thing that you can do, and you can just harvest them immediately as soon as possible and keep the fruits from falling on the ground. That's the simplest way.
I might add just one thing that's been really successful in Monrovia is there's been a lot of people joining Facebook pages, group pages. And if they can't utilize all the fruit, they put it in bag, put a sign up that it's free, and people are sharing across the neighborhood. So that's also something that's been very successful here.
That's an excellent idea.
Perhaps I haven't heard any stories of bears going to those spots to pick up all the fruit. That might happen. Next question is from Ashley Royal. She says, thank you for the presentation. There's been a bear coming into my yard recently. If we were to be outside and he or she walks up, what's the best thing to do?
Well, again, the bear is looking for food. It's not really looking for a confrontation with you. So situational awareness is very important. When you're out in your yard, you're in bear country, you know that there's a possibility of having a bear in your yard. And if it comes on scene, just back off quietly. Don't turn your back to it and run, but back off quietly, and then go into your house and let it leave on its own. If your backyard is open and there's, you know, an obvious escape route, that's when you can use the air horn and the pots and pans and get it off of your property from a safe distance.
Thank you. From Scott, as well as Joyce, so kind of both asking a similar question. Scott asked, what attracts bears to crawl spaces under the house? Are they just looking for a den? And Joyce also mentioned she has a bear who stays under her house, accessing through the crawl space. She has metal grates bolted in, but the bear just keeps ripping it off. Any suggestions on keeping them out? So why crawl spaces, and any suggestions on what to do?
Crawl spaces, they typically pick houses that are kind of quiet, and they're just looking for a cool, shady place to sleep in. So yeah, we get lots of calls, and I haven't really seen too many really good solutions on the grate situation. Anything that a bear can get its claws in, so if you have a metal mesh over your crawl space, they can get their claws into that and just rip it out. People have tried bolting wood to the side. That doesn't work because they can get their claw in there and just pull it out. So something that's a pretty heavy gauge metal that's flush to the building so that that bear can't get the claw under is going to be your best bet.
Follow-up question from Brenda, who asked about the bear management plan. Can we do bears and add coyotes to the same wildlife management plan, or do you do separate plans?
Oh, sure. The city of Pasadena has bears and coyotes.
Okay.
Yeah.
From Shelley Shepard asked, our yard has no fencing between the front and the back. Periodically see deer and coyotes, worry about letting the dog outside and encountering bears. Any tips on what to do if the dog encounters the bear? Also, what type of bird feeders are a problem? And is there a seed type that matters, or hummingbird feeder, or different kinds of bird feeders that are different than others?
Okay, it's a lot of questions. Okay, so regarding the dog, it really depends on, you know your dog best and what the reaction is going to be. But for the most part, the bear isn't going to be in your yard to try and get your dog. Again, it's there for human food sources. So for the most part, you know, keeping your dog indoors if you know that it's protective of your yard, keeping the dog indoors, and also it's going to take a lot of agitation for that bear to take a swipe at the dog. So it's not going to like come in and immediately attack your dog. So you use that time to get it back into, I'm trying to think of all the other questions. I'm sorry, I'm not answering this very well.
The other one was about I think you answered the first part. The other one was about bird feeders. Is there a kind of seed or a hummingbird feeder or something that you want to avoid and others you want to use?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you know, people love their birds, and bird feeders are, you know, really great things. But yes, it's primarily the seed that drops on the ground, and that's going to attract the rats, that's going to attract the bobcats, and the bears as well, because the bears are, you know, in the wild, they eat berries and seeds and termites and grubs. So yeah, you want to try and avoid those. I don't really know. I haven't really encountered a bear attacking a hummingbird feeder, but it's sugar water. So I would probably avoid hummingbird feeders as well, and plant native plants that would attract hummingbirds and other birds into your yard. That's a good alternative if you love your birds.
Okay. Next question comes from Michael. On the trails in the foothills of Monrovia, do I ever need to worry about bear attacks?
Well, again, situational awareness. You know, the bears are not out there trying to attack us. Most of our attacks that we have in California are in a campground situation. And if you think about it, you know, you're in a campground and you've had the campfire going and it's night, it's quiet. Now everything's settled down. Maybe the kids went to bed with s'mores stuck in their hair. So the bear's sniffing around, wondering what all the excitement was about, smelling the smells, and it comes to the tent, sticks his head in, and everyone wakes up and freaks out, and the bear takes a swipe because it's surprised. So that's the scenario of the most common type of attack that we get. We really don't get attacks of people on a trail. You know, it can happen, of course. These are wild animals, and you don't know what might have, you know, led that bear up to that particular point in time. But again, as long situational awareness, make sure that you're not hiking alone, make sure you make a lot of noise, talking. A lot of people in bear country will carry bear bells on their backpack, so that you are announcing your presence to the bear, so you're not surprising it. So that's the best advice I have for a hiking situation.
Next one, it looks to be a question for the city, so I'll answer this one briefly. A question on the city posting signs to state that feeding wildlife is prohibited. Are there any posted? We do have signs posted at all of our public parks and public grounds, mostly up on in the foothills at Canyon Park, within the preserve. But I'm not aware of any signs that are posted around the neighborhoods, especially around those areas like Norumbega, where we get a lot of bear activity. So we do have them posted at public parks and public grounds, but not necessarily out in the neighborhoods, to my knowledge. Another question from Robert. What other techniques can you use for hazing the bears to get them to leave other than noise? For example, would you consider spraying with a hose, or would that only antagonize?
You'd have to get pretty close to the bear to spray it with a hose to make any effect. So I probably wouldn't try that. I would stick with noise.
Okay. And Roberta sounds like she's got some experience. She says that bears do go after hummingbird feeders too.
Yeah, it's sugar water, so yeah.
Bill, similar. I bet if you sprayed a bear with the hose, it probably would enjoy it. And I think those are all the questions at this point in time. One thing I'd like to say, there's a lot of comments on the chat bar for the great presentation. You two have clearly done this before, and we certainly thank you for coming to do it with us here in Monrovia. Thank you all so much to the participants here. If you have any follow-up questions, want a copy of the presentation, just let us know. But as always, feel free to reach out to us anytime that you have a need or concern. And thank you all again.
Thanks for having us.